The story of Africa is changing, and it's changing fast. Today, we're going to talk about a bold, historic project that's sending shockwaves across the globe. Africa built a canal. And it didn't ask the world's permission. For decades, Africa has often been seen through the lens of dependency, dependent on aid, dependent on foreign investment, and dependent on approvals from powerful global institutions. But a growing number of African nations are rewriting that narrative, taking ownership of their future and refusing to wait for anyone's approval. This canal is one of the most powerful symbols of that shift. It started as a dream decades ago. A vision shared quietly by engineers, economists, and leaders in several African nations. The idea was simple but ambitious: to cut a man-made waterway through one of Africa's busiest trade corridors, dramatically improving trade, cutting shipping times by days, and creating a direct link between two vital coasts. But at the time, no one took it seriously. Experts from Europe and America dismissed it as a fantasy. Impossible, they said. Too expensive, too complicated, too unstable. International lenders refused to fund it. Some even called it a geopolitical risk. Why? Because it would give African nations too much control over their own trade. But African leaders refused to back down. Instead of bowing to outside pressure, a coalition of African countries pooled their own resources. They mobilized their own engineers and construction crews. They struck quiet deals with private investors in Asia and the Middle East, investors who didn't attach political strings to their money. And, most importantly, they decided that they didn't need anyone else's permission to build something that would benefit their people. The construction of the canal was one of the most difficult engineering challenges Africa had ever faced. It cut through deserts, forests, and rocky plateaus. Thousands of workers labored day and night in extreme conditions. Equipment broke down, materials ran short, and some foreign critics even predicted it would collapse mid-construction. But did didn single quotes t dot asterisk in fact, every setback was met with an African solution. Local communities were hired and trained. New methods were developed on the ground. African scientists and engineers innovated to adapt to local conditions. The canal became more than just a construction project. It became a symbol of what Africans could achieve when they believed in themselves. And then, one quiet morning, years ahead of schedule, the first ship sailed through. It was a moment of triumph. Crowds lined the banks cheering and waving flags. Leaders gave speeches calling it a new chapter in African history. Traders celebrated the dramatic reduction in costs and travel time. Entire regions that had once been economically isolated were suddenly connected to the global economy. But perhaps the most remarkable reaction was from the rest of the world. European trade analysts were stunned. American think tanks scrambled to assess the impact. International media outlets, who had ignored the project for years, suddenly ran headline after headline. Africa stuns world with new canal. Game changer in global trade. Africa takes control of its own destiny. Some criticized Africa for bypassing international oversight. They called it reckless and provocative. But many ordinary people around the world saw it differently, as a long overdue act of self-determination. For Africans, this canal isn't just about trade. It's about dignity. It's about proving that they don't need to be told what they can or can't do. It's about refusing to ask permission to improve their own lives. And that's what makes this project so powerful. In many ways. This canal is more than just water cutting through land. It's a river of pride, ambition, and determination. It sends a message loud and clear to the whole world. Africa will no longer be a passive player in global affairs. Africa will no longer wait for others to decide its future. Asterisk, this is Africa's century. And the canal is just the beginning. Asterisk, if you've ever doubted what Africa can achieve on its own terms, look no further than this bold, beautiful canal, built with African hands, African minds, and African courage. Asterisk, the world may not have given its permission, but Africa didn't need it. Asterisk this time. It's about energy, and how one African nation turned its darkest nights into a shining example of independence. Asterisk, for decades, the people of this country lived with blackouts almost every night. Entire cities plunged into darkness for hours. Businesses shut down early. Hospitals struggled to keep life-saving machines running. Students studied by candlelight. Asterisk, foreign energy consultants would come in, make big promises, and leave little to show for it. Big international lenders offered loans, but only under harsh conditions, often forcing the government to cut social programs just to qualify. Every time, the message was clear. Africa couldn't solve its own power problems without permission, without outside help. Asterisk, but that was about to change. Asterisk, a young minister of energy stood up one day at a press conference and said something that shocked the nation. We are done waiting. We will power ourselves. And they did. The government launched an ambitious plan to build one of the largest solar power grids on the continent. They didn't ask the World Bank. They didn't wait for approval from foreign investors. Instead, they partnered with local banks, local engineers, and even crowdfunding from citizens who wanted to invest in their own future. Villagers donated small pieces of land for solar farms. Young engineers designed new ways to store energy, using locally sourced materials. Entrepreneurs began building affordable, locally manufactured solar panels. Even schools and universities got involved, training thousands of technicians in just a few years. Asterisk, at first, critics laughed. It's too small, they said. It will never meet demand. But little by little, lights started to come on. First, in small villages, then in towns, then in big cities. Hospitals, factories, and schools began to buzz with power. For the first time in living memory, children in rural areas could study at night. Businesses extended their hours. Farmers started running irrigation pumps and food processing machines right in their fields. Asterisk, and the most surprising part? Within a few years, the country not only met its own needs, it started exporting electricity to its neighbors. The world finally took notice. International media called it the African solar miracle. But the people who lived through it knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was the result of years of grit, creativity, and faith in themselves. Asterisk, when the lights finally stretched across the horizon, the young minister of energy stood at the largest solar farm in the country and said, "We were told we couldn't. We were told we shouldn't. But we didn't need permission to light our own way." That's the new Africa, an Africa that builds, innovates, and thrives not by asking what the world will allow, but by doing what's right for its people. Asterisk, and just like the canal, this story isn't the end. It's the beginning of a brighter future powered by Africa's own hands. Asterisk, if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More stories of determination and progress are coming, because Africa's story is only just getting started. Asterisk. For decades, Africa's economy was tied to raw materials, minerals, oil, coffee, cocoa. The world saw Africa as a continent of resources to extract, not ideas to invest in. International tech companies mostly ignored Africa, claiming that the market was too poor or too underdeveloped for serious innovation. Asterisk. But one group of young African entrepreneurs decided to prove everyone wrong. It started in a cramped office in the heart of Nairobi, Kenya, a group of engineers, programmers, and visionaries who believed that Africa could leapfrog old systems and create its own digital revolution. They didn't have billion-dollar investors. They didn't have government grants. What they had was grit, cheap laptops, and a deep understanding of what their people needed. And what their people needed was a way to move money. In many African countries, millions of people don't have bank accounts. Traditional banks didn't serve remote areas, and sending money through old systems was slow, expensive, and often unsafe. But almost everyone had one thing, a mobile phone. So this team built a simple idea into a national phenomenon, a mobile payment platform. At first, critics called it a gimmick. Nobody will use this, they said. International banks scoffed. Even local regulators tried to block it at first, claiming it was risky. But the entrepreneurs refused to stop. They launched anyway, and the results were staggering. Within months, millions of people started using the platform to send and receive money, pay bills, and even buy groceries, all from their phones. Farmers sold crops without middlemen. Families sent money home instantly, without paying steep fees to foreign remittance services. Entire villages that had been cut off from formal finance suddenly became part of the economy. And this wasn't just a Kenyan story. Soon, other African countries adapted the model and built their own digital payment systems. The idea spread across the continent, transforming everything from small businesses to government tax collection. Today, Africa leads the world in mobile payments. Yes, leads, not follows. What began as a local solution is now studied by economists and copied by countries as far away as Europe and Asia. When asked why they didn't wait for the banks, the founder said, why wait for someone else to solve our problems? We live here, we know what we need, and we don't need anyone's permission to build it. That mindset is what's changing Africa today. Across the continent, young innovators, engineers, and dreamers are solving African problems with African solutions, creating an economy that works for them. And it's only the beginning. Africa is showing the world what happens when you stop asking for permission and start building your own future. If you're inspired by this story of ingenuity and resilience, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for even more stories of African innovation and pride. Stay tuned, because Africa's best stories are still to come. For centuries, Africa's cultural treasures, priceless artifacts, sculptures, manuscripts, jewelry, were taken away. During colonial rule, they were shipped to museums in Europe, displayed behind glass, while African people were told their own heritage was better kept overseas. Whenever African nations asked for their treasures back, the answer was usually the same. It's too complicated. They belong to the world, or even, you can't take care of them properly. But African leaders, artists, and activists decided they'd heard enough. Instead of begging for approval, they started a powerful movement to bring their history home. It began with campaigns and protests, but soon turned into a bold cultural strategy. Countries like Nigeria, Benin, Senegal, and Ethiopia invested millions into building new, world-class museums and cultural centers. They trained a new generation of curators, conservators, and historians. These weren't just buildings. They were statements. We are ready to preserve and celebrate our own story. Then came the legal challenges. African lawyers began filing formal requests and lawsuits to recover stolen artifacts. Some European governments resisted. Others tried to delay. But African nations didn't stop pushing, and something amazing started to happen, piece by piece. treasures began to return. Asterisk, the famous Benin bronzes, looted over a century ago, started making their way back to Nigeria. Ethiopia brought home sacred manuscripts and imperial crowns. Senegal opened a dazzling museum of black civilizations, filled with art and history that had long been kept in foreign vaults. Asterisk. At the same time, African artists began creating contemporary works inspired by their reclaimed past. Young designers incorporated ancient patterns into modern fashion. Filmmakers and musicians used the story of repatriation as inspiration for new works. Schools started teaching children about the rich, sophisticated civilizations that existed long before colonialism. Asterisk. And something even more important happened. Pride began to grow. Asterisk, Africans who once visited European museums to see their heritage could now walk into their own museums and feel the weight of history in their own hands. Communities gathered to celebrate the return of sacred objects. Elders wept at the sight of long-lost relics finally home. Asterisk, when asked why they didn't just accept the status quo, one Nigerian historian said, asterisk, how can we know where we are going if we don't know where we come from? And why should we ask anyone's permission to own our own story? This is more than just about artifacts. It's about identity. It's about telling the world that African history is African property, and it belongs to the people who lived it. Asterisk, the movement to reclaim Africa's cultural heritage is far from over. But it's already one of the most powerful examples of what happens when Africa stops waiting and starts acting. Asterisk. Africa is no longer asking for its history back. It's taking it back. Asterisk, if this story of cultural pride and determination inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories about Africa's unstoppable journey forward. There are many more stories of resilience, hope, and triumph to tell, and you don't want to miss them. Asterisk. For decades, Africa, a continent with vast fertile land, rich soil, and generations of farming knowledge, was paradoxically portrayed as unable to feed its own people. Every year, billions of dollars in food aid flowed in, and yet hunger and malnutrition persisted. Asterisk, foreign experts came with plans and policies. Big agribusinesses pushed imported seeds and expensive chemicals. And every time African farmers tried to take control of their own systems, they were told, you need our help to modernize. Asterisk, but some African farmers, innovators, and leaders finally sighed. Enough is enough. Asterisk, in one East African country, a quiet revolution began. Asterisk, it started when a small group of farmers noticed that the imported seeds they were buying every year were ruining their soil and making them dependent on big corporations. Meanwhile, traditional African seed varieties, adapted to local conditions and passed down through generations, were being forgotten. Asterisk. So the farmers decided to revive them. Asterisk. They traveled to remote villages to collect indigenous seeds. They built community seed banks. They trained each other in sustainable farming techniques that improve the land instead of exhausting it. They grew drought-resistant crops suited for African climates rather than ones designed for European farms. Asterisk. At first, international experts dismissed their work as unscientific and old-fashioned. But the farmers kept going. Asterisk. They organized into cooperatives. They pooled their money to buy shared equipment. They developed their own local markets so they didn't have to sell their crops at rock-bottom prices to middlemen. Asterisk. Then something remarkable happened. Asterisk. Within a few seasons, their yields started to rise. Families began eating better. Children grew healthier. Villages that once depended on food aid began producing surpluses, even exporting to neighboring regions. And it didn't stop there. Other African countries began adopting similar strategies, empowering small farmers, promoting indigenous crops like millet, cassava, and sorghum and building regional food markets. Governments invested in local agricultural research instead of relying on foreign studies. Urban areas created rooftop gardens and city farms to supplement supplies. The result? In some regions, hunger rates dropped faster than ever before. Farmers took pride in feeding their own people. And a powerful message spread across the continent. We don't need to ask permission to grow our own food. One farmer put it beautifully, we are not poor because we cannot grow food. We were poor because we were told we couldn't do it our way. Now we feed ourselves and no one can take that away from us. Today, this movement for food sovereignty is gaining momentum. It's about more than farming. It's about dignity, self-reliance, and control over Africa's own destiny. Africa is proving that it doesn't need to depend on foreign aid or imported solutions. The solutions were always here in the hands of its people. If this story of resilience and ingenuity inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are countless more stories of how Africa is standing tall, taking charge, and building a future on its own terms. Stay tuned for the next one, because Africa's story is far from over. For years, whenever Africa's place in science and technology was discussed, the narrative was often patronizing. Africa needs help catching up. Global institutions and foreign media would rarely mention African contributions to modern science, let alone imagine the continent reaching for the stars. But one small country decided to change that. It started with a dream that seemed impossible to many: to launch its own satellite into space. Critics scoffed. Why waste money on space, they said, when you have so many problems on the ground? Others claimed Africa didn't have the expertise or infrastructure to join the space race. But the country's leaders and scientists believed otherwise. They built a small but dedicated team of engineers, astronomers, and students. They collaborated with universities to train young minds. They constructed a modest space center and started experimenting with small-scale rockets. They tapped into Africa's growing tech ecosystem to design and build their first satellite, not for prestige, but to solve real problems back home. The satellite was designed to monitor agriculture, predict weather patterns, and track natural disasters, all crucial for farmers, planners, and emergency services across the country. After years of hard work, long nights, and many setbacks, the team was ready. And one bright morning, the world watched in surprise as the satellite lifted off into orbit. For the first time, this small African nation had its own eyes in the sky. Farmers received better forecasts and improved their harvests. Authorities tracked floods and droughts more accurately. Schools proudly taught their students that their country was now among the nations. Exploring space. The achievement sparked a ripple effect. Other African nations followed suit, investing in their own space programs, not to compete with the United States or China, but to empower their people with technology that met African needs. Today, Africa has its own space agency, headquartered in Addis Ababa. Countries across the continent are launching satellites, building observatories, and training the next generation of African scientists. One of the young engineers from the original team summed it up perfectly. They told us space wasn't for us, that we should leave it to others. But why should we ask permission to dream big? The sky belongs to everyone. Africa's space journey is just beginning, but it's already a powerful example of what happens when you stop asking for permission and start building your future. Because the truth is, no one can tell Africa how high it can reach. If you're Inspired by this story of vision, determination, and courage, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are more incredible stories to come, stories that prove Africa is not just rising, but soaring. Asterisk. For decades, Africa was seen as dependent on foreign aid when it came to health. Whenever there was an outbreak, malaria, HIV, Ebola, or more recently COVID-19, the world rushed in with emergency aid, vaccines, and medicine, and each time, African nations were forced to wait for supplies, often getting them late, sometimes in limited quantities. Asterisk, but a handful of visionary African doctors, scientists, and policymakers decided enough was enough. Asterisk, one country, long struggling with high rates of preventable diseases, made a radical decision. We will make our own vaccines, right here in Africa. Asterisk, at first, the idea seemed impossible. The technology to produce vaccines at scale didn't exist locally. Foreign pharmaceutical companies were unwilling to transfer knowledge. Critics warned it would take decades and billions of dollars to catch up. Asterisk, but the leaders of this effort stayed focused. Asterisk, they built a state-of-the-art biotech campus, partnered with African universities to train young scientists, and sent students abroad to learn advanced techniques. They formed alliances with like-minded countries and independent labs willing to share technology without strings attached. Asterisk, and when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, it became clear just how crucial their work was. Asterisk, while wealthy nations hoarded vaccines, Africa was left at the back of the line. But in this small biotech campus, African scientists were already producing their first batches of vaccines, not just for COVID-19, but also for polio, yellow fever, and other diseases that had ravaged communities for decades. Asterisk, in just a few years, this country went from being entirely dependent on imports to producing millions of doses, not only meeting its own needs but supplying neighbors as well. Asterisk, health clinics reported dramatic drops in infections. Parents no longer had to worry about their children missing out on life-saving shots. Confidence grew as people saw that African-made vaccines worked just as well, if not better, than imported ones. Asterisk, the director of the project said in an interview. Asterisk, the world has always treated African lives as less urgent, but we will not wait in line anymore. We will protect our own people with our own hands. Asterisk, and the ripple effects have been huge. Other African nations are now building their own pharmaceutical industries, determined to end dependency once and for all. Regional collaborations are forming to ensure every corner of the continent can access medicine produced in Africa by Africans, for Africans. Asterisk, this isn't just about health. It's about dignity. It's about refusing to accept the idea that African lives are less valuable, and proving that African innovation can save millions of lives. Asterisk, once again, Africa didn't ask for permission. Asterisk, if this story of resilience and determination inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. There are more powerful stories to come, because Africa's journey to self-reliance and pride is far from over. And you'll want to be here to witness it. Asterisk, for generations, African education systems were largely shaped by colonial legacies. The curricula in many countries still focused on European history and Western models, often neglecting Africa's own cultures, languages, and ways of knowing. Even after independence, governments were pressured to follow foreign best practices and rely heavily on aid to fund schools and universities. Asterisk. But one country decided to break that mold. Asterisk, it all began when a group of educators and community leaders asked a simple but profound question. Why are we teaching our children about everyone else's story, but not their own? Asterisk, they noticed that students could name European kings and presidents, but didn't know the names of their own heroes, their own rivers, their own philosophers. Farmers' children were learning about farming in Europe, but nothing about the crops that grow on their own land. Even languages spoken at home were banned from the classroom. So the country launched an ambitious and courageous plan to decolonize education and design a curriculum for Africans by Africans. Teachers, elders, historians, and even school children were brought into the process. Together, they rewrote textbooks to include African histories, African sciences, African literature. Lessons were translated into local languages, while students also learned international languages to connect with the wider world. Practical skills were added to the curriculum: agriculture, entrepreneurship, technology, equipping students to thrive in their own communities rather than just preparing them to leave. At first, some outsiders criticized the move, calling it nationalistic or narrow. But the results soon silenced the doubters. Attendance rates soared as children felt more connected to what they were learning. Girls, especially, stayed in school longer because lessons reflected their lives and respected their cultures. Young people began starting businesses, developing inventions, and solving local problems rather than waiting for outside solutions. Graduates of the new system didn't just feel educated, they felt empowered. One teacher explained it best: "We don't need anyone's permission to teach our children who they are. Education should be a mirror, not a window into someone else's world." Inspired by this success, other countries across Africa are now rethinking their education systems, shifting from dependency to self-definition. New universities are being built with African priorities in mind. Local research centers are tackling African challenges with African-led research. The message is clear: knowledge is power, and Africa is taking back its power. Once again, without asking permission. If this story of self-determination and pride inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are still so many more stories of how Africa is reclaiming its future, step by step, on its own terms. Stay tuned for the next one.